The information contained in this podcast is an expression of opinion and does not constitute investment advice. This is the Gold Money Foundation podcast with Andy Duncan, keeping you up to date with expert opinion on precious metals and the markets.
Hello and welcome to this Gold Money Foundation podcast with me, your host, Andy Duncan. Today I'm at the Auburn Institute at the Austrian Economics Research Conference, and I'm with the author of a new book which is coming out from the Mises Institute, Harry C. Verizza. And I actually have in my hand a fantastic signed copy of his book, which is called It Didn't Have to Be This Way, Why Boom and Bust is Unnecessary, and How the Austrian School of Economics Breaks the Cycle. Now, Harry's looked at this problem from a particular angle. Harry, can you tell us about the angle that you've looked at this problem from?
Yes, what happened was I was asked to write the book about 2006. And when I was asked to write the book, they just needed a small thing on Austrian economics. But as I could see what was developing, the storm clouds on the horizon, I told my editor, I said, this thing is going to become very, very serious. And as it becomes serious, it's going to prove the Austrians to be correct. So I started doing the research, and I used, as much as possible, non-Austrian sources. Because you see, everybody in some way has to be attached to reality.
Yeah.
Regardless of how dreamy they get. They got to walk on the same earth, and they realize that a locomotive with square wheels isn't going to run. So what began to happen is I began to see that they were affirming the Austrian school, although they were opposed to it.
Yeah.
For example, George Soros, who was not a friend of the Austrians or a friend of liberty, came out and said, there's something wrong with mainstream economics. It couldn't predict this cycle. It can't explain it, and it doesn't know what to do. Now, he has to realize that from reality. So I took all of these folks, Keynes and Soros and whoever else I could take, and every time I had to prove a point, I put in someone who was non-Austrian, thinking that this would make the case far stronger.
Yeah. I love the Soros quote used in your speech this morning, that he said that the mainstream had failed.
Yes.
Yeah.
They all realize it's failed. I mean, but they don't want to say it. It's almost like, what's this the story about the naked emperor? Nobody really wants to say that he's walking around stark naked, but they all see it. And so they'll equivocate and they'll talk around it, but they will say things that affirm what the Austrians believe and the Austrians hold.
I liked your other point as well, that you said that you can get Keynes to say anything, and you really enjoy it when you quote Keynes back to Keynesians.
Oh, yes, it's wonderful. I mean, Keynes, there's no position Keynes didn't hold. I mean, he was pro-gold, he was anti-gold.
Yeah.
He was pro-protection, he was anti-protection. He helped set up Bretton Woods, which was a quasi-gold standard, and yet he believed in fiat money, but then he talked about the fact that if you increase the supply of money and credit, it will create a bust. I mean, he says all these things, and it just depends which Keynes you want to use.
Yeah. Now, you've broken the book down into three different sections. In the first part, you have this attack on positivism, can't even say it. Can you describe what positivism is?
Yes. Positivism is the attempt to use the physical sciences as a model for the social sciences. And what it goes back to Isaac Newton. When Isaac Newton wrote his Principia Mathematica, it conquered the world. And everybody was fascinated with the physics that he came out with, because it could predict all kinds of things. It could predict eclipses, it could predict gravity, everything. And they said, oh, well, this stuff will apply to the social sciences. So then you had it happened in two ways. Physics became the model for economics, and the Darwinianism became the model for society.
Yeah.
Darwinianism led, according to Mises in his book Socialism, also reaffirmed by historian Carlton Hayes, led directly to the survival of the fittest and then World War I. Carlton Hayes really goes into explaining that. Mises mentions it. Mises mentioned it in 1922, Hayes in 1941.
Yeah.
Okay, then, on the other hand, you had the positivism of the physics, and they were trying, well, we can predict the economy. We can have mathematical equations that predict this.
Yeah.
And probably the height of this thing was long-term capital management, in which they had all these Nobel Prize-winning economists and mathematicians. They thought they had discovered the secret that they could get rid of risk. And now we can make billions of dollars. And what happened? the whole thing blew up.
Yeah, picking up nickels in front of a steamroller. And
Yes,
the steamroller got them.
yes. It's exactly. And Mises and Hayek, and I mean, it goes back to Aristotle. Aristotle said it won't work. Edmund Burke said it won't work.
Yeah.
Okay. All of the Austrians said this is not, mathematics doesn't belong here.
Yeah.
In fact, Keynes himself, at the end of the general theory, said it wouldn't work.
Yeah.
And yet these are people calling themselves Keynesians. And this is the irony of this thing. They have to live in reality, but they're trying to live something non-real.
I was thinking it's weird that even mathematics doesn't follow the positive model, does it? Because it's built on axioms. 1 + 1 = 2. And then you can build on those axioms. And Austrianism is based on the same kind of logical process.
But Austrianism starts with the one axiom, which is human beings act for a purpose. And that means human beings. And so the anthropology of Mises is identical to the anthropology of Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle. There is something about the human person that is much different than the physical world.
Yeah. Motivations and so on, all these things.
Yes, and we'd even say that the human being, if you wanted to take it even further, possesses what would be a spiritual soul, which is not mathematical.
Yeah. So the second part of the book, then, we move on to how we got to where we are, where your hometown of Detroit is not seen as being the friendliest place to visit in the world.
No, it's not anymore. But in 1952, Detroit had the highest standard of living in the world.
Yeah.
And it was government intervention after government intervention after government intervention that destroyed that city. And I saw it as a young boy. I mean, I grew up in Detroit. And I used to take the bus downtown, or the streetcar. We had streetcars at that time. And it was a wonderful city. And then you had the coming of the labor unions, particularly the teachers' union and the other labor unions. They consistently supported government intervention, and intervention after intervention destroyed the place. They raised taxes to pay for it, and they higher taxes, more welfare, higher taxes, and eventually the city is just a state of absolute decay.
Yeah. Where do you see it going in the US now? I mean, because if we're right, America's actually been in a depression for 4 years. And yet if you go around Auburn and look in the restaurants are full, people are chatting, there are flash cars on the road, everything looks okay. Is everything okay, or is everything crumbling underneath, and where do you think it's going?
Well, I think in a sense, I mean, there's always going to be some people doing very, very well. Okay, and remember, this Auburn is a town that is completely supported by government infusions through student loans. Oh. So the Federal Reserve is printing money. The students have plenty of money that they're borrowing to get themselves through college. So the restaurants are full and everything's wonderful. This is not the case in a lot of the country. In a lot of the country, the small businessmen are, you can see boarded up shops, boarded up restaurants, people going out of business. So it looks, and around university towns, looks wonderful. But this is very, very, very selective.
And where do you think it's going to end up then? Where do you think we're going in America?
Well, I think in a sense, America will, as I mentioned, will survive because we have a very intricate division of labor. We have a very ingenious people, and we're innovators. Now, that I think will continue. What's going to come apart is the whole progressive era that started with Bismarck in Germany. Mm-hmm. And it went to the Fabians in Great Britain, and it went to the progressives here. This is over. Yeah. And the problem is, it's just a matter of, I think when, as one of the speakers at the conference today said, when they run out of the reserve account, as they run the reserves of society down, which they are in the process of doing, then at a certain point, it reaches a tipping point, and everybody realizes that they can't pay the Social Security, or they'll just tell them they'll just default on it. And when those defaults start happening, then I think we'll have a tremendous metanoia, a change of mind in the United States, and people will realize the bankruptcy of this whole thing. Yeah.
So then we move on to the third part of the book, which is your analysis of human action. Now, you've used a lot of irony and things there. Can you tell us about this third section of the book?
Yes. I think what happened in the book, if you take a look at it, there are three axioms of human action. There are Mises, Aristotle, and Thomas Aquinas. Yeah. Man acts for a purpose. Yeah. Okay? Every human action is purposeful. Secondly, every human action acts for what the actor sees as something better. Yeah. And thirdly, everybody has to see a way to achieve their goals.
Yeah.
Okay, that's universal. Then I went into some of the axioms of human action. Okay, every time you act, you change.
Yeah.
Remember, let's say you're playing tennis.
Otherwise, what's the point of doing anything?
And Andy, let's say you're playing tennis. Okay, the more you play tennis, the better you get. Yeah. Assuming you play with somebody better than you. Okay,
but that's everybody in the world.
Yes, but I mean, whenever you read a book, you become a better reader.
Yeah.
So in other words, that really is a formulation of good habits or virtue. Okay. Number two, every human action involves learning. In other words, every time a person acts, they learn something by it. Yeah. Okay. It may have been a mistake, and a lot of us learn more by our mistakes than we learn by our successes, but we learn something by it. Every human action has unintended consequences. We don't know what the outcome is going to be, and therefore you are dealing with risk. Okay? Every human action is historically unique. It will never happen again. And I often tell my classes, every single one of you is completely unique. There's never been any person like you, and there never will be anyone like you. You have unique talents. Yeah. And the Austrians play off this to argue against population control. Yeah. Because they're saying every human being has something to contribute. Yeah. Okay, and then every human action, it takes place in time and is irreversible. So in other words, what we're doing now, we can't reverse this like a car can be reversed. So these are the axioms of human action, which then apply to the entire idea. And remember, the Austrian School is based on individual human action, not aggregates like the Keynesians or the Chicago School.
I must say, I actually have to teach Keynesianism every now and again for my clients. I teach it, and then I teach them real economics.
Yes.
Aggregate demand and aggregate supply and short-run aggregates. Oh, it makes my head spin, even though I've been through it so many times. What's your goal, then? What's your goal in writing this book? What are you trying to achieve? What are you trying to change?
Well, I think the book really started when I was a boy in the 7th grade. And I had a wonderful teacher by the name of Ed Schnaubelt who taught us the American Constitution. And ever since then, I got an interest in it. And the other part of that was my father and uncles, when we used to get together for family parties, the men would all go on the back porch with beer. And they'd be drinking beer and talking about the Great Depression. So I had an interest in not only the American Constitution, but what causes depressions and recessions. And that led me eventually through a number of steps to the Austrian School. And it's been a study of mine, going back to 1962 or 63. And so I read the Austrians and the solution for this, what do they call it, that the knights used to go for the
Holy Grail.
The Holy Grail. The Holy Grail was this explanation, and my hope is that I became I wouldn't say an expert, but fluent in the Austrian School, and my hope is that to really, by putting out the good ideas, to change the course of human affairs.
Yeah. So it sounds like a wonderful book. I'm really looking forward to reading it, especially now that you've signed it for me.
Okay.
Just before we go, have you been following the Cyprus story at all?
Well, Andy, you told me a lot about it. I think this is significant because you see, it isn't. People look at things not what will happen, but what could happen, and all of a sudden, everybody is saying, "Well, wait a minute. If these governments can do this, if that government can do it, why can't mine do it?"
Especially if you're in the Eurozone.
In the Eurozone. And I think this may be the end of the Euro, which in a sense, Andy, I think would be a good thing because I think we go back to competing currencies. Yeah. And I think that Hayek's idea of competing currencies may come true. And this may be a much more effective break on governments than the gold standard.
Yeah, we could go back to a Deutschmark again and a Swiss franc, which isn't pegged to the euro, and then the Swiss franc and the Deutschmark, and then be the least ugly children in the street and force everyone else to not be as bad.
Oh, yes, because all of a sudden, I think there was a book published here, and I forget the author's name. He said that the French considered the Deutsche Bank, or the Central Bank of Germany, more dangerous to them than the German army. Yeah. Because the capital will flow out of France into Germany.
Yeah. Well, if you read Philip Bagus, the price...
Bagus, that's what I mean, yeah.
The price of the euro was... the price of German reunification was giving up the Deutschmark.
Yes. And now, through some completely unexpected consequence, it happened in Cyprus. I mean, think of how human history works. completely unintended consequences in Cyprus could lead to the collapse of the Deutschmark, not the Deutschmark, but of the euro, which then leads to competing currencies. And then Germany now is reunified, but now they have their mark back.
And then the French won't like that very much at all.
Oh, no, the French will hate that. I will tell you a little story. When I was in France, and I had a French couple that my brother, we had that exchange, where they exchanged kids. So my nephew was in France, and their son was here. And so when I was there, I said to the Frenchman, we're sitting on this apartment overlooking all of Paris on Saint-Cloud. And he's complaining about the French tax system. And I said to him, Michel, you can't be having these taxes. This is one of the most prosperous cities I've been in, Paris. He said, oh, well, it's the black. I said, noir? No. He says, it's the black. He says, in France, every business hands two things. They give them the check at the end of the month, which the government knows about, and then the cash envelope. And I said, well, what do you do with all this cash? You put it in Switzerland? No, it's not safe. In Germany, in Deutschmarks.
Oh, well, there we are.
You see, so what was happening is, with competing currencies, you will have an enormous amount of competition going on, and these governments will be in competition with one another for the strongest currency, because that means the lowest interest rates.
And we get into kind of Professor Hopper's work then about the competition of the bands, don't we?
Oh, yes.
But that's probably as much as we can do in this interview.
Sure.
It's been great speaking to you, Harry, and I'm really looking forward to your reading your book.
Okay.
Subscribe to the Gold Money newsletter at www.goldmoney.com to receive email updates on new articles, videos, and iTunes podcasts from our Gold Research section.